Hello, this is David Duke. Other than war, no institution of recorded history has violated more human rights, caused more deaths, more suffering than that of slavery. Although slavery still exists in parts of Africa and other parts of the world, the last great trafficking in human slaves occurred in bringing Africans to the New World beginning in the early 16th century and flourishing up to the middle years of the 19th century. The most egregious, cruel, and murderous aspect of this period was the transatlantic slave trade, often called the Middle Passage. Scholarly studies of the loss of life during the transportation of slaves to the Americas suggest that between 7 and 10 million Africans suffered indescribable cruelty and perished in the Middle Passage. The human suffering and death from the African slave trade is the cornerstone of white guilt both in America and around the world, and has been tirelessly promoted by both academic and popular media. The film Amistad by Steven Spielberg is the cinematic standard of films about the slave trade, and a more recent treatment is the excellent film called Amazing Grace. Amistad carefully portrays the slave trade as a Christian European-American enterprise. It is terribly unflattering portrayals of American leaders, the Queen of Spain, and conspicuously Christian slave traders. It has numerous images of Christian crosses accompanied by scenes of horrific treatment of black slaves. Before Amistad, though, in 1992, the Nation of Islam caused a tremendous controversy when it published the book The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. It quoted prominent Jewish historians who claimed that the African slave trade, and indeed slavery in the West, for the last 2,000 years, was thoroughly dominated by the Jewish community. Now, 15 years before the publication, I appeared on the largest black talk show in America and for the first time exposed the issue before a national audience. As strange as it might seem to some of you, in spite of my politics, I had a role in setting in motion the rising black awareness on this issue. 5 years after The Secret Relationship was published, Amistad was made. I think it was perhaps a remedial effort to put the genie back in the bottle. It was set in a thoroughly Christian New England. The actual center of the American slave trade was at Newport, Rhode Island. It is no minor coincidence that Newport had America's oldest synagogue and was home of the largest thriving Jewish community in the New World. Although Spielberg portrayed the horrific slave trade as thoroughly a Christian affair, here are some words of the major Jewish history of the early Americas called New World Jewry. It's by S.B. Liebman and the American Jewish Historical Society. He wrote about those who owned and manned the ships, the perpetrators of this mass human cruelty and murder. Quote, "They came with ships carrying African blacks to be sold as slaves. The traffic in slaves was a royal monopoly, and the Jews were often appointed as agents for the crown in their sale. They, the Jews, were the largest ship chandlers in the entire Caribbean region, where the shipping business was mainly a Jewish enterprise. The ships were not only owned by Jews, but were manned by Jewish crews and sailed under the command of Jewish captains." Now here's how I came to discuss the Jewish slave trade on Black Perspectives in the News on PBS. In the late 60s, I became acquainted with a slave trade researcher by the name of Walter White. He wrote a short booklet called Who Brought the Slaves to America? I contacted him and began doing my own research into the slave trade. I've read all the official Jewish histories pertaining to it. I've followed the issue for over 25 years now, scanning official Jewish general histories on the subject, and often those histories were published by Jewish historical societies and groups. These were histories written by Jews for Jews, and here's some direct quotes from the leading Jewish historians writing about the African slave trade. Now remember, you can find all the academic citations in my books, My Awakening and Jewish Supremacism. Prominent Jewish historian Mark Raphael, in his book Jews and Judaism in the United States, a documentary history, wrote, quote, "Jewish merchants played a major role in the slave trade. In fact, in all the American colonies, whether French, Martinique, British, or Dutch, Jewish merchants frequently dominated." This was no less true on the North American mainland. where during the 18th century Jews participated in the triangular trade that brought slaves from Africa to the West Indies and there exchanged them for molasses, which in turn was taken to New England and converted into rum for sale in Africa. Isaac da Costa of Charleston in the 1750s, David Franks of Philadelphia in the 1760s, and Aaron Lopez of Newport in the late 1760s and early 1770s dominated Jewish slave trading on the American continent. Jewish historians record old Jewish documents showing how the slave trade was so thoroughly Jewish that slave auctions throughout the Americas had to close on Jewish holidays. Brazil received far more African slaves than North America. A. Witzner, another official of the Jewish Historical Society, in his book Jews in Colonial Brazil, pages 72 and 73, wrote, quote, "The buyers who appeared at the auctions were almost always Jews, and because of their lack of competitors, they could buy slaves at low prices. If it happened that the date of such an auction fell on a Jewish holiday, the auction had to be postponed." Studying the Jewish histories of the New World, I began to learn of a carefully recorded Jewish history that you and I are not permitted to know about. I discovered that many centuries before the transatlantic slave trade, that Jews had dominated the slave trade in the entire Western world for the last 2,000 years, even as far back as Roman times. Duncan Wagnall's Jewish Encyclopedia, in Volume 10, page 48, writes, quote, "The trade in slavery constituted the main source of livelihood for the Roman Jews." To show you how widespread the Jewish slave trade was and how influential Jews seduced authorities centuries ago, just as they do in modern America and around the world, in the 5th century, Pope Gelasius permitted Jews to introduce slaves from Gaul into Italy on the condition that they were non-Christian. In the 8th century, Charlemagne explicitly allowed the Jews to act as intermediaries in the slave trade. In A History of the Jews from Babylonian Exile to the End of World War II, published by the Jewish Publication Society of America, the author writes, quote, "The Jews were among the most important slave dealers in European society." And here's a quote from the famous Jewish historian Jacob Marcus in the Encyclopedia Britannica. He matter-of-factly talks about the Jewish control of commerce in the Middle Ages. Quote, "In the Dark Ages, the commerce of Western Europe was largely in his hand, in particular, the slave trade. Not only were Jews the principal slave traders, they had markedly higher per capita holdings of slaves than did non-Jews." Jacob Marcus wrote in the United States Jewry, 1776-1985, page 586, quote, "All through the 18th century into the early 19th, Jews in the North were to own black servants. In 1820, over 75% of the Jewish families in Charleston, Richmond, and Savannah owned slaves. Almost 40% of all Jewish householders in the United States owned one slave or more." The actual fact is that even in the South, less than 5% of white people owned slaves. Less than 2% of whites owned slaves in all of pre-Civil War America, while 40% of Jewish householders owned slaves. Now notice how only guilt is ascribed for white people in slavery, even though Jews were 2,000% more likely to own black slaves than was any white Gentile person. When I broached some of these facts on Black Perspectives in the News, the host was fascinated. And the underlying question is why there is a collective white guilt assigned for the slave trade, but no collective Jewish guilt. Why are black Americans or white Americans not allowed to know who the primary slave traders were? The Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish organizations discovered that I documented the dominant Jewish role in the American slave trade, and they were desperate to prevent this historical truth from reaching a wide audience. Jewish leaders, Saul Rosen, Harry Bass, Peter Munchik, filed an injunction in the Common Pleas Court in Philadelphia asking the judge to block the program. The Jewish judge, Stanley Greenberg, then ordered that the program not be aired unless he approved it.
It would take more than a man to lead the slaves from bondage. It would take a god